Hey now. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Clearing Confusion. Today we're going to talk about another obscure RPG series. Yippee. Okay, so by now I figure only the RPG fans are watching, and all the Halo players clicked off the video to watch a different video. Probably something to do with teabagging. Quick, RPG fans. What is the best Final Fantasy game? Wrong. Also wrong. Nice try, but wrong. Bzz, try again. Now you're not even trying. Wrong. Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. Final Fantasy Tactics is interesting because it's the sort of game that probably never would have come out in America a few years earlier, but due to the overwhelming popularity of Final Fantasy VII, it got a release here, with Square banking on brand recognition and the good feelings people had about Final Fantasy VII leading to high sales. And it worked. While I'm sure some were put off by the switch from a standard JRPG to a heavily tactical turn-based strategy game, for the most part the game got excellent reviews, with many people, including myself, considering it to be the best game with Final Fantasy in the title. So that being said, wait. Didn't I say that I was going to be covering an obscure RPG series? Well, Final Fantasy is about the opposite of that. Well, around the same time that Final Fantasy Tactics was gaining popularity, attention was brought to another PlayStation strategy game that is very similar. So similar, in fact, that I remember a lot of people, and I mean pretty much anybody who came across the game, Tactics Ogre, declared it to be a rip-off of Final Fantasy Tactics. And to this day, it seems to be the case that most people seem to think that Tactics Ogre is a ripoff. I mean, Tactics Ogre came out pretty much right after Final Fantasy Tactics. They're both turn-based strategy games. They have similar titles, and man, look at the graphics. The game is nearly identical. How the hell did they get away with it? Well, for those of you who believe Tactics Ogre to be a blatant copy of Final Fantasy Tactics, what if I told you it was the other way around? The Tactics Ogre actually came first. It was a remake of a Super NES game. And what if I told you that said Super NES game was a sequel, and the second game in the series, but also somehow it's the seventh, and that the game would subsequently be remade again, but that time it would be developed by Square Enix themselves? Yeah, you want to hear about that. But before I go through the origins of the Ogre series, I should address the striking similarities between Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics. You can't ignore the fact that both games are very similar in not only title and gameplay, but the graphics are nearly identical. So now that you know that Quest, the makers of Tactics Ogre, did not rip off the game, you can't help but wonder if the infinitely more popular and beloved Final Fantasy Tactics was itself a blatant rip-off. And the answer is yeah, kinda. While the Tactics series were developed by Quest, after making Tactics Ogre, several employees who had worked on the game parted with the company. As Square was looking to make a strategy-based spin-off of Final Fantasy, they quickly hired these guys, who basically made a game that was incredibly similar, but had infinitely more marquee value and would be played by more people due to the name Final Fantasy. So not only did Square hire ex-employees of Quest to make their game, but the developers worked on both, basically meaning that they ripped off their own game. Anyway, let's talk about the origin of the series. The original game in the series was called Legendary Ogre Battle, and it came out for the Super Famicom in Japan in March of 1993. It was released in America a few months later for the Super NES under the title Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen. The game was created by Yasumi Matsuno, who liked his RPGs to be dark, adult, and political. He would later work for Square, where he'd create the world of Ivalice, as seen in the Final Fantasy Tactics games Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII. He based the story of Ogre Battle on real-life events such as the Yugoslav Wars and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, which were all recent events at the time. If Ogre Battle and The March of the Black Queen sound familiar to you, but not in a video game sense, that's because they're both taken from the rock band Queen, of whom Matsuno was a huge fan. Both Ogre Battle and The March of the Black Queen were songs off of the band's second album, Queen 2, and there are other references to Queen found in the game. For example, there's a location called the Ryan Sea, which is a reference to the Queen song Seven Seas of Rye, which was both on the first and second albums, Queen and Queen 2, respectively. Although Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen is the first game in the series, it is referred to as Episode 5, much in the way that the original Star Wars was referred to as Episode 4. But while the Star Wars series has seen prequels to fill in the first 3 episodes, the first 4 episodes of the Ogre series have yet to be developed. As I mentioned, the game was developed by Quest, and for the Japanese release they self-published it. But here's something interesting: the American version was published by Enix, who would of course later absorb the Square company and become Square Enix. Ogre Battle has been remade and re-released 3 times. The first was on the PlayStation in September of 1996 when it came out in America in July of 1997. This version added better graphics for the battle scenes, including a rotatable camera and new special effects for spells. The PlayStation version was published by ArtDink in Japan and Atlas in America. It next came out on the Sega Saturn in November of 1996. In this version, the graphics for battles and spells were a lot more like the original game, but the sprites were way more detailed, and there was voice acting. Unfortunately, the Saturn version was never localized to America. The Saturn version was published by ArtDink. Lastly, the Super NES version of the game was released on the Wii Virtual Console in all regions. This version was published by Square Enix, who since the original releases have bought the Quest company outright. The Ogre Battle series has a tendency to all be very, very rare, and if you don't get a copy of the games right away, you can be out of luck. The easiest and cheapest way to get the game is on the Virtual Console, where it costs the same as any other Super NES game. If you want to play the enhanced remakes, it gets expensive or difficult. A quick search on eBay for Buy It Now auctions for the Saturn version got 2 results for the game, one being sold for $39.99 and the other for $9. Both versions were complete, and looking at the auctions, I can see no reason for a $30 difference, but oh well. That doesn't seem so bad. You can get a complete copy for $9, but the problem is you'd need a Japanese Saturn and of course knowledge of the Japanese language. A search for the PlayStation version is just painful. The cheapest price for the American version was $50, though this seems like a deal where the person doesn't know what they're selling. They do admit that the game is scratched also. The highest a used copy went for was $150, and new sealed copies go up to $325, plus shipping and handling, of course. If you want the Super NES version, the original, be prepared to pay out the nose. There are no new sealed copies here, and the prices for used copies range from $249.99 for a complete copy to $64.99 for only the cartridge. I did see an Ogre Battle cartridge for $52.49, but it had most of the label torn off of it. The second game in the series is Tactics Ogre: Let Us Cling Together. Once again, the title comes from a Queen song, To Toritare, Let Us Cling Together, from the album A Day at the Races. Although it's the second game in the series to be developed and released, in the saga it's called Episode 7, meaning that there's a gap between it and March of the Black Queen, which was Episode 5. The gameplay is different from the original and more similar to what you're familiar with if you've played Final Fantasy Tactics. After making the game, Matsuno left Quest and went to work for Square, along with several other employees, and created Final Fantasy Tactics. Though he had no involvement in the next Ogre game's development, he did write the script for it and left it with Quest. Interestingly, Matsuno would stay with Square and came on with Square Enix and stayed on until the release of Final Fantasy XII, in which corporate meddling changed the direction of the game from his original concept to one more familiar with Final Fantasy fans. While with Square and Square Enix, he created the world of Ivalice, which is the world several games take place in, including all the Tactics titles, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII. Tactics Ogre: Let Us Cling Together was originally released for the Super Famicom in October of 1995, but sadly, due to the poor sales of the original game in America, it was not localized to America. Like the original game, Tactics Ogre saw remakes on both the Saturn and the PlayStation, though in this time the Saturn came out first in December of 1996. It was published by Riverhill Soft. Unfortunately, just like the first game, the Saturn version stayed in Japan. The PlayStation version came out in September of 1997 in Japan and was localized in 1998 to America. I don't have an exact release date for the American version, but it was sometime after Final Fantasy Tactics, which was in January of that year, which led to the belief that Final Fantasy Tactics came first and that Tactics Ogre was a ripoff. This, of course, ignores the fact that they were obviously in development at the same time, and that Tactics Ogre was a remake. The PlayStation version was published by Atlus, forever bringing us games that might otherwise have stayed in Japan. The original Super Famicom version of the game next made it to the Wii Virtual Console, but only in Japan, and seeing as how the original was never localized, there was pretty much no chance of getting it here. Luckily enough, the full remake came out for the PSP, both as a disc and as a downloadable PSN title. This came out in November of 2010 in Japan and February of 2011 in America and Europe. Considering the series' history of rarity and expensiveness, and the fact that the PlayStation was the only choice for Americans previously, a $30 PSP game was a real boon. What's even more interesting is that Matsuno, the original creator, returned to Square Enix to work on the title. What's really nuts, at least to me though, is that the idea of the game being a ripoff of Final Fantasy Tactics was even further perpetuated by the PSP remake, as the original Final Fantasy Tactics had also had a remake on the PSP back in 2007, entitled Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions. So once again, it seemed that Tactics Ogre was following Final Fantasy Tactics. If you want to play this game, and trust me, you do, it's a masterpiece, the PSP version is easy to find and inexpensive, at least if you know what you're doing. If you want to copy the actual game for PSP, I looked, and the cheapest copy goes for $19.95, and that's complete. Not bad considering the game started off as $30 and it came out earlier this year, and considering the series it's in. It can get expensive though. A sealed copy with the huge strategy guide is going for $129.99, and a sealed one without the guide goes for $99.99. If you want the only other English version, the PlayStation one, it gets expensive. Hell, there are assholes selling the case and manual only for $20. That's without the game. One seller had the game, disc only, for $56.99, so I guess you could combine it with the other one for a total of $76.99, but I did find a complete version for $53.99, so there you go. If you want it in mint condition, expect to pay about $100, and I didn't see any sealed copies at all. The Saturn version has an insane amount of variants, with used but complete versions going for as cheap as $12 to as much as $148.80. How very specific. Of course, that's in Japanese. If you want the Super Famicom one, it's not so bad. I saw the cartridge alone for $5, with $6 shipping, lol, and a couple of ones ranging from $15 to $36.80 for complete. So, yeah, the PlayStation one is the only one that's insanely expensive, and it's also the only one in English. Of course, if you can't find any of these, the PSP version is available as a PSN download, so there is that. The third game in the series is perhaps the most interesting. It's the only one in the main series to not be directed by Matsuno, though he did write the script, and it was the only one never to receive a remake. This one was on the Nintendo 64, and it was called Ogre Battle 64: Person of Lordly Caliber. It was released in Japan in July of 1999, and America, thank fuck, in October of 2000, making it a later era N64 game. Interestingly, the Japanese version was published by Nintendo, but the American one was published by Atlus. Hey Nintendo, how about giving the publishing rights to Xenoblade The Last Story and Pandora's Tower to Atlus? They'd release them. Anyway, Ogre Battle 64 is considered Episode 6, meaning that it takes place after the first game, Ogre Battle The March of the Black Queen, but before the second game, Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together. Meaning that with these three games we have Episodes 5, 6, and 7. Unfortunately, the first four haven't surfaced yet, but maybe one day we'll get them. This one was great because if you were an N64 owner, you knew how rare it was to get an RPG on the system, much less a tactical strategy RPG, and a good one at that. Of course, the game is hard to find, but luckily it managed to find its way to the Virtual Console in all regions. That is really, really a lucky thing, because if you want the original Nintendo 64 cartridge, be prepared to sell your Xbox and all your games. You can get the cartridge alone for usually around $50, give or take. Complete versions almost always cost over $100, going up to $225 for a new copy. And as of my search, there's a brand new factory sealed copy for $210, another one for $225, and another one for a staggering $489.98. Keep in mind, you can get a PlayStation 3 and a bunch of games for that amount of money. There are only 2 more games in the Ogre series, and they're both considered spin-offs. The first of those is Ogre Battle: Legend of Zenobia Prince. This game is considered a gaiden, or supplementary story to the original game Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen, meaning that it's a story that takes place at the same time as those events, but focuses on different characters. The gameplay is pretty much the same as The March of the Black Queen. Unfortunately, there's no way to play this one in English. The only release was on the Neo Geo Pocket Color in June of 2000, and no localization, ports, or remakes have ever come out. If you do speak Japanese, and you have a Japanese Neo Geo Pocket Color, well, I couldn't find the damn thing on eBay, so good luck. The second spin-off was Tactics Ogre: The Night of Lotus. This one is another gaiden, although they consider it to be more of a prequel. But although it takes place before Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen, which was Episode 5, Tactics Ogre: The Night of Lotus is not considered to be Episode 4. This one was released on Game Boy Advance and was published by Atlas, and you know what that means, it came out in America. The Japanese one came out in June of 2001, and the American one in May of 2002. Even though it was on the GBA, it's predictably rare. An eBay search turned out cartridge-only sales for around $30, and complete copies for around $50. The most insane sale was for a lot of 5 games on the Game Boy Advance. Most of them are rare, including Tactics Ogre, which was going for $249.99. So that's the Tactics Ogre series. We've had episodes 5, 6, and 7, though it came out in the order of 5, 7, 6, and a bunch of remakes and 2 spin-offs. It was created by Quest, ripped off by Square, and then bought outright by Square Enix. Because of the weird order of the storyline that started with the 5th episode, I sometimes refer to it as the Star Wars of video games. If only it were that popular. Oh well. Join me next week and we'll clear up this Super Mario Bros. 2 shit once and for all.